Olá, eu sou Gisele, esse é mais um Poesia ao Meio-Dia, que é um programa promovido pela Cátedra William Butler Yeats, da Faculdade de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas da Universidade de São Paulo, e acontece sempre às últimas quartas-feiras do mês, ao meio-dia. E hoje temos a alegria e a grande honra de receber o nosso convidado, poeta Pat Bourne. Pat Bourne é irlandês, nascido em Portland, hoje mora em Dublin, mas, além de poeta, ele escreve prosa, é locutor, é editor da Daedalus Press, e tem vários livros de poesia que estão no site dele, que podem ser vistos aí na tela. Hoje transmitimos algumas das capas dos livros dele, que estão no site patborn.com, e ele editou também, né, várias antologias de poesia e prosa. Ele foi apresentador do The Poetry Program and the Enchanted Way na rádio RT1, e tem muitos prêmios, né, como de poesia, como Patrick Kavanagh, como o Lawrence O'Shaughnessy Award for Poetry nos Estados Unidos, e também é membro da SDANA, que é a espécie de Academia Brasileira de Letras na Irlanda. Então, é uma imensa honra e alegria tê-lo conosco. Pat Bourne, thank you very much for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here, Gisela. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's an honor and a great joy and pleasure. And I would like to start by asking you to tell us what led you into writing. You have, when we access your website, we have your 1990 book, The Shape of Water, The Unwound Clock, that's from 1990. And what has changed? So 2 questions in one, if you don't mind. First, what led you into writing? And then what has changed from 1990 to 2021, which I think is your last book publication?
Okay, so I think maybe like a lot of writers, I didn't necessarily make a decision to write. It was a process of elimination. I was looking for things I didn't want to do, and they included further study after leaving school, work of any kind. I didn't want to work for anybody. I wanted to take what we might call in English the scenic route. I wanted to get from where I was to somewhere else, but not in a hurry, to take my time and see what would happen. And at the time, I used to play music a little bit for a hobby. So when I finished school, I started to play music on the street. I started to be a busker at a time when it wasn't terribly popular in Ireland, but it was still possible to make some money and meet people and have a connection with the world, have a role, an identity. And after doing that for maybe 2-3 years, I started to realize that even though I enjoyed it so much, I wasn't really very, very good. I certainly wasn't good enough to be, I think, a full-time musician, but I still play music all these years later. And so my direction changed slightly from the music to the words, and the songs I was trying to write at the time gradually started to become short stories and poems and small things. I didn't exactly know what they were, but that gave me an appetite for making more things. And then, because Dublin is a small city, and it's a city with a strong, as I'm sure you know, with a strong literary identity, I kept meeting people who were either writers or musicians who read books, and not all musicians read books. And so I found myself in a wider community, and that reinforced my decision to keep doing what I was doing. And I've done that ever since. I've done other things, but they're always related to writing. I've worked in radio, but as a poetry broadcaster, I've organized literary festivals, but always with a strong emphasis on poetry. So I've always tried to keep close to the thing I love. And if it doesn't change the world, or if it doesn't bring the success or riches that other things might bring, I don't care. It's just, I think of it more as a hobby, something I really just like doing. And everything else then comes from that. And every now and then, very often, in fact, to keep the sense of discovery alive, I try to change what I do. I try to change the medium, or I try to add something or subtract something or give myself a problem to solve so that it doesn't just become a habit. Because I think habits are not very good for the creative soul. You need to surprise yourself and take yourself by surprise. So by doing that over a number of years, I've always stayed close to poetry. But what I do now, to answer your question, is very different, I think, than what I was doing even 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, and maybe different than what I will do in 6 months from now. I don't know.
Lovely. I think, yeah, whoever reads your poetry can notice how much you have changed from the initial writing to nowadays. And then this is also curious. You're bringing up the idea of not making a habit out of writing, at the same time that writers also need habits for writing habits, right?
It's true, but an interesting thing, to go off on one of many tangents, I suspect. In recent years, to go backwards, in recent years, I started making short films, mostly beginning with my phone, and then with maybe a better camera and an iPad, etc. Either writing new poems and making films as I went along, or going back to older poems and wondering to myself, what would this look like if I was to do it now? And I made one recently, which was a poem from my first book, which was published in 1990. So I'm not rewriting the poem. You know, once you publish a poem, it's over. You have to leave it alone. There's a temptation you go back and fix things, because you keep changing as a human being. Hopefully you keep evolving, and sometimes you improve. You learn something new, although you can become more stupid as well, in my case. But occasionally you notice something now with the benefit of hindsight, looking back, and there's a temptation to go and change it. I try to resist doing that, but what I do really find interesting is to go back and say, what would this poem look like, or what would this poem be like if I added music now? Because my taste in music is different than my taste in music was 30 or 40 years ago. So there's a constant conversation with the self, with oneself, if you write, because even if nobody reads what you make, and that often happens, that's just the reality, you are your own reader. So you are communicating to yourself. You put something in a time capsule, and then you come back in a week or a month or 10 years, and you see it with new eyes. So it is a constant conversation, at least with a part of the self. And that makes it interesting. And it also makes it dangerous, because the world can become very small. It can become reduced to one point, and the only inhabitant in that world is me, which is a terrible idea. So, the thing about talking about poetry is the opposite of everything you say about poetry is also true. That it has to be about the self, but it also should never be about the self. It should always be looking outwards. And, the opposite of every rule is true at some stage. And again, it goes back to what I said at the beginning. I think for me, to continue writing, I have to keep changing the rules. And sometimes the rules say, now this is totally for you and about what you are interested in at this moment. And then in another situation, the rule is you cannot be in this poem. The word I, the first person singular, I, Pat Boren, cannot be in this poem. And that's a very good discipline, I think. It's refreshing, um, because by taking things out, you see other things. It's a little bit like if you walk down the street in the evening and people have yet to pull their curtains in Buenos Aires. So you see right inside their apartments. And you can't hear anything, but you can see this man and this woman talking or having an argument. And you are able to supply in your imagination all of the dialogue. And or you see a television with the sound turned down, you still understand so much, though so much is being withheld. And this is I think very good method to stimulate the imagination, to say you can't have everything. You can't have all the colors in the rainbow today. You can only have and here's the ingredients, and off you go.
Thank you. So can we have your voice for one of the poems in this The Unwound Clock book from 1990? And I was thinking of when you are moving into a new house.
Okay.
Please.
Do I know where it is now? I'm hoping it's here. I'm hoping it's near me.
I think it's in the document with the translations.
Oh, of course. You see,
Yeah. Sorry, it's out of order.
I have it. I'm a messy poet, so the documents
I mess things up because
they are. Say here, good luck with that. No, okay, so here it is. I'm a little bit hoarse today. Excuse me. Okay, so when you are moving into a new house, be slow to write the address in your address books, because the ghosts who are named there are constantly seeking new homes, like fresher students in rain-steamed phone booths. So by the time you arrive with your books and frying pan, these ghosts are already familiar with that easy chair, have found slow creaks in the floorboards, are camped on the dream shores of that virgin bed. When I moved to Dublin first after leaving school, so kind of maybe 1981, 1982, and I was busking. I was living on very little financially. So I lived in a series, maybe 20 plus, very, very grotty, horrible, stinky, smelly, little one-room apartments. The phrase in use at the time was bed sits, a bedroom come sitting room, stroke sitting room. So the bed was here and the cooker was there and the fridge was there and the door was there. Everything was within reach. And I was constantly being pushed out of one and having to go and look for another. So I was always on the move, and the thing I'd have was a guitar and a sleeping bag and a frying pan. I always had a frying pan to bring with me everywhere. So there's always, not always, but there's often, I think, for anyone who writes, there's a trigger, an idea, or an image, a picture that's based on something that may have happened, or you may have seen, or that you may have done. And then other, you might say even fictional things are magnetically attracted to them, so that they become something else. Or at some stage in telling that simple truth, I had to move flat bedsit from here to here, that in that process, something else happened. And it's almost like there was a little moment of mythological awareness, that you see yourself not as yourself, as someone else. You see yourself like a camera sees you when it's behind you, which is an interesting little game. If you walk up the street and imagine seeing yourself from behind, because you're used to seeing images of yourself from front, but to follow with you, that, the FOV, is it, the gamer's kind of view, or the drone following someone. It's interesting because it's both you, but it's not you. Your identity is not there. And that's often what happens in a poem, that you write something out of an autobiographical impulse, but it has to become more than autobiography. Very many of my poems, very many, are triggered, are given to me by something autobiographical, something someone says to me, or something I heard or remembered, something I found. But if they're only autobiography, they're not interesting. They're only my diary entries, and it's not good enough. They have to become more than the initial idea. And
Excellent.
I can't say, well, it's true and therefore it's good. The truth doesn't matter. The only truth that matters is the one that you discover when you're writing something more focused or even more trivial. Writing is all about accidents, and you have to be there when the accident happens. You have to be actually writing at the time, and then the lightning comes and goes boom. And it might come and it might not come.
Would you say filming your poetry is a kind of rewriting?
Uh, yeah, in some ways it is. I wonder about it myself. In some ways it is. Quite a lot of the poems that I've been making films of, they didn't exist until I started making the film. So I would go out, say for instance, for a walk with the dog who's asleep beside me now, or pretending to be asleep. Um, and he will bring me for my daily walk, because if I don't go, it's not a good day. And on that day, like everybody, I take little notes in my phone if I have a great idea, or I have a voice memo or whatever. And also I take a photo, or I take a little 5-second video clip. So I realized during the COVID pandemic, during the lockdown period especially, that I wasn't just going out and writing something in the phone or in a notebook or remembering it to bring home, that I was taking little films as well. And sometimes I had one sentence and then a picture and then another sentence. And I realized that the picture was part of the unfolding of the idea. So I had the choice. I could either then describe the picture, sentence one, the opening, sentence two, description of the picture that I then took, sentence three, the end, summarize, and the end. That was one way of doing it. So I would reduce all the different media just to the words. And that's what I've done for nearly 40 years. I have an idea that's musical, but I put words on it, and it's only words. And then I thought, well, why not? Uh, if the pandemic is going to come and turn the world upside down, it should turn my world upside down as well, creatively, or otherwise I'm not paying attention. I'm just not caring enough to change my ways. So I thought, okay, I'm going to change my ways, and I changed them by, instead of describing the images that I was seeing, start putting the images together. And that had two effects. One, it meant I didn't have to describe a dog because you can see the dog. But also, it meant that there were parallel narratives going at the same time. So the images can tell you one thing. Sometimes they have one conversation with the viewer, but the words can have a different conversation. If you have a picture of a dog, you do not have to say, well, this is my dog. You can say it, and every now and then the text and image can meet, and it's like a little bow, like a bow you wear around your neck, you know, or like a bow when you tie your shoes. It holds everything in place. But if every image and every line is bowed together like that, well, then there's no magic and there's no purpose, because one doesn't use the other as a pad, a launch pad from which to fire off like a rocket. So you you know, if you start experimenting like this, where you have images and words, and then the third element, music, you will have a triangulation. You're juggling. You have three balls of different colors in the air. And sometimes the yellow ball is up here and the red ball is in this hand and the blue ball is in this hand. And then you throw up the blue ball and the yellow ball comes down into this hand and the red ball goes over there. And so now you have a different arrangement. So it's constantly in motion. And that's engaging. You know, I found it engaging. Um, and that's that's again, that's kind of the important part for me, that I'm constantly doing something, and maybe something I don't know too much about. So I'm trying to figure out how this works, and what's in it for me. You know, is there anything in this? That's it.
Excellent. Thank you. I think you gave us so many ideas here, and you touched on so many other items I want to talk about. But before we continue, I would like to read the poem you have just read into Portuguese, if you
Right.
don't mind. Quando
Lovely.
estiver de mudança a um novo endereço. Quando estiver de mudança a um novo endereço, escreva com vagar o endereço no livro de endereços, porque os fantasmas ali nomeados sempre estão à procura de novos lares, feito calouros em cabines telefônicas embaçadas com o vapor da chuva. Então, ao chegar com seus livros e panelas, esses fantasmas já terão se familiarizado com a tal poltrona confortável e já terão se deparado com os rugidos morosos, morosos no assoalho, e terão acampado às margens dos sonhos da cama virgem. You mentioned the idea of movement, and I think your book from 1996, The Shape of Water, has a poem called A Reason for Walking. So if you can give us the honor of reading that poem,
Okay.
and then I follow with the translation, or after your comment, whatever, please.
Okay. A reason for walking. I'll read it to you first, because the truth is I haven't seen this poem in probably in 20 years, so I'll have to try to remember what it's about, or who wrote it. A reason for walking. Words when I think, thoughts when I word. Hours with this thought only words, not what I feel. The streets offer not promise, but escape. Harmony Row, Misery Hill. Any named place better than this. Back home, the summer sheets, an open book, if blank. But then the light impression of our bodies, curled up, the hieroglyph for love. So I think it's a poem about, I don't generally like poems about writing, because I think they can, what I was saying earlier, they can make that spiral very small, and they can be too self-conscious and not reaching enough towards the world, as if the writer's calling was somehow of a different caliber or importance than that of someone who had a more physical, functional job in the world. And writers should never fall into that trap. They have to be citizens of the world as well, even though they might work with different materials. But the materials of writing are words. And sometimes when you look at your own name, you know, that game when you were a kid in school and you wrote down your name and the teacher said, now Just said, write that down 5 times, and you wrote 5, and you suddenly start thinking, am I spelling it right? It looks so weird. And you know that the familiar can suddenly become irritatingly unfamiliar. And so if you're writing all day and you're writing something as small and focused and concentrated and as desirous of being lucky as poems, you often get totally mitered, confused, and you don't really know what you're talking about. You just think, am I losing it here? And so the solution is, and was when I wrote this, which is 30 years ago, to go out for a walk. And at the time I was living in the center of I was living in the center of Dublin City, near, anybody who knows it, near the back of Trinity College. And I'd walk down south and out towards the sea. And on my circuit, I passed a whole lot of names, named streets, etc. But of them, 2 of them I used to pass were Harmony Row, row meaning a row of houses, so an idyllic place, Paradise Street, you could say, Harmony Row, and the other Misery Hill, like, the most hellish name you could imagine for a place name. So the circuit of the walk, which is also the circuit of the poem, is to go through Harmony Row, but always come back to Misery Hill. Because if you don't, you're only living in one half of the world. You're not seeing the entire circuit of human existence. And that's what the poem is actually about. And then when I come home, or when the speaker of the poem comes back home, the summer sheets are an open book. The bed, the unmade bed. So it's another poem about a bed, which strikes me as interesting now, an early poem about a bed. The sheets of the bed are thrown open, unmade, like the pages of a book. But then the impression of the people who slept on that bed is like a hieroglyph. It's like something that is a pictorial meaning, carrying information, but not carrying it as words, carrying it as a visual quantity. So the solution, if you like, that the poem discovers or even proposes is that when you get too caught up in words, that you shift, and you shift to seeing. You shift to seeing and hearing and moving, walking, get out in the world, get out of your head. You go and explore. And it's interesting that we find that poem now, which, as I say, I haven't looked at in 20 years. It's the best part of 30 years old, but it's doing exactly what I ended up doing during the pandemic, which was taking my own advice. And that's what I mean. You often discover things. If you write for a long time, you inevitably discover things about yourself that you didn't know, and that you didn't know you knew. And if you could find even the diaries you kept as a schoolgirl when you were 14, apart from the embarrassment of them and the histrionics of them, and all of that, we all have that in our past. But there will always be perceptions there that you don't remember having. So they're both familiar and strange, and they're like an injection of otherness. They can bring you alive in an amazing way. The only problem is that to go back all the time, there's a lot of the past on the planet. Our culture is a little thin layer over a whole melting pot of history. And if you keep going back, it's very hard to extract yourself again to live in the present. So again, you've got to go through Harmony Row, come back through Misery Hill, but you have to come back to now. You have to live now. And the test of the poem is whether it means anything today, not whether it has a nostalgic quality. That's only something to be enjoyed, like Netflix entertainment, to be enjoyed and forgotten an hour later.
Excellent. Thank you. I love the idea of going up Harmony Row and coming back through Misery Hill, even though the whole journey met.
Of course, you could go the other way. Every now and then, you could say, I need a break today. It's been a bad day. And you could get Misery Hill over with. So go through Misery Hill and then come back by Harmony Row. You could do that.
I think that's the movement of writing. I think you said writing can be therapeutic for the writer. So,
Yeah.
so if you don't mind my reading the poem in Portuguese.
Please.
Motivo para caminhar. Quando penso palavras, quando verbalizo, penso por horas com este único pensamento, só palavras, não o que sinto. As ruas oferecem fuga, nada prometem. Alameda da harmonia, colina da miséria, qualquer inscrição melhor que estas. De volta ao lar, a roupa de cama veranil, um livro aberto, mas em branco. Eis que paira uma leve impressão. Nossos corpos maranhados. Hieroglifo do amor. Thank you. Also, I think when we chose this poem, I think I had in mind the idea of the whole elaboration on poetry that is more material, more lyrical, but we can talk about it in a few minutes. Before we do that, I'd like to go back to your book as The Hand, the Glove, which is from 2001, and the poem Flash. The title of this book, actually, Pat, is really interesting for us in Brazil because it's also the title of a short story by one of the most famous and important writers for us, Machado de Assis, A Mão e a Luva.
Oh wow! I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, so I was really happy to read that as the title of your own book. So if you don't mind by asking you to read the poem Flash in that book, please.
I will. That's so interesting. Okay, I'll read it and then I might say something about it afterwards if I can think. Okay. Flesh. The spirit, despite bad press, loves the flesh. It enjoys nothing more than body odor, the warmth of a crotch or the electric touch of lips. Those dark religions which have banned the nether regions to the nether world, to hell, can cast all the spells they like, can single out for blame those who refuse to feel shame about their bodies, children, the old, the savage inhabitants of the third world. But most of all, those women of loose morals whose torture is somehow part of the quarrel about sanctity and sin and the vessels the soul is to be found in. Enough idols and bones, enough gleaming chalices and altar stones. I say it again. The spirit loves the flesh as the hand the glove. And if you doubt me, ask my dying father, which he would rather, to be done at last with love and pain, or to leave, but then come back to flesh again. I think it's kind of self-explanatory, I suppose, in some ways. It's a poem. It's a poem about the way organized religion serves no one, where it reduces the possibilities, the options for all those who dedicate themselves to it, because it becomes, however it starts, it becomes monolithic. It becomes, in very many cases, it becomes patriarchal as well, obviously, as we've seen all over the planet in so many instances. But it's something that the individual is encouraged to turn to in his and her hour of need, but which is often ice cold in its response to that same individual, that the rules are there to be upheld. Whereas for poets, the rules are there to be broken. The rules are to be established to motivate and to inspire. But that's their function, and it's their only function. And we never know what we lose by making certain rules. So there's an incentive to remake the rules as we go. And the poem and much of that book, as the hand, the glove, as the hand, meaning as the hand sew the glove, but as the hand also within the glove, the shape of what you see is a representation of something deeper, but is not that deeper thing. It's the eye has access, but only so much access. And again, it's about the hidden discoveries and the hidden meanings of the world and what we find at different times in our lives in the familiar. And the book was written just around the time of and after my father's death. And he was, as it happens, not a wildly strict, but he was a very committed religious person, Catholic, and from a large Catholic, traditional Irish Catholic family. So the torment in the poem, the personal torment in the poem was I was losing him, we were losing him. But again, the poem has to have a reach that goes further than that sometimes. And also, it has to do the opposite. Sometimes when you're reaching to make a statement or to feel a statement, you have to earth it in something that is meaningful and exposing of the self. So the poem makes me uncomfortable, which I think is probably a good sign that it's venturing into those two areas. It's also loosely, it's in couplets, in stanzas of 2 lines that are more or less traditionally rhymed, but the lines are of varying, more conversational length, if you like. They're not regular. So there's something regular about the poem, but there's also something both more relaxed and both more uncertain. And I think the combination of a voice that's clearly angry, and we all go through an anger in bereavement before we start to accept a loss. There's something, for me, listening to it now or hearing it now again, there's something very interesting because, as I say, it's both angry, but it's also tentative. It's uncertain. I don't think anger, when it is certain, is useful to anyone, because it knows all the answers. And the job of poetry is not to know the answers. It's to have better questions. It's to interrogate things, but it's up to the the reductionist politicians, etc. They come up with the simple answers, but no answer is ever sufficiently simple. It's always complicated, and I like that complication that I didn't maybe think about in the poem. It was probably instinctive at the time. So, but I'm just reading it as if it's someone else's poem now and trying to find something interesting to say about it. That's it.
Excellent, thank you. I think I'll skip the translation for this because I also would like to hear you talk a little bit about your latest productions, or more recent, not latest, but more recent ones, such as the book you both edited and collaborated on, which is Our Shared Japan, which is really a wonderful book. I recommend to everyone interested in the dialogic poetic atmosphere in Ireland, that has started with Yeats and is still on. And in that book, you have 2 poems that called our attention. One of them is A Natural History of Armed Conflict and Way of Peace. Of course, as I said, the dialogue between Ireland and Japan, between poets, has started back to Yeats, but it's been on, and you also edited Japanese poets into English, and that's fabulous. Maybe you want to comment a bit on that before I ask you to read one of the 2 poems, or maybe both of them, and I again skip the translations.
Oh, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what. I'll read you the second one first. I'll forget about the first one second. I'll read you the second one first, and then I'll answer your question because I think it makes more sense in a way. So, in this poem, I grew up in a small town in the middle of Ireland, Portlaoise, and when I was about, I don't know, maybe 13 or 14, a karate club opened in the town, and it like all over Ireland and maybe all over the world, there was a whole boom in the martial arts following the death of Bruce Lee. And every, especially young guy, but not exclusively, seemed to be fascinated by the martial arts in general. And there were karate clubs opening everywhere. And like a lot of my schoolmates, my classmates in school, I joined the local karate club in Portlaoise. We used to meet on a Wednesday night. And I was never a particularly sporty type person, but I got a lot out of it. And I think a lot of what I got out of it was this idea, an imagined world. It created a Japan of the mind for me. And I was still only a kid. And that has always stayed with me. I've never been to Japan, but I'm somewhat fascinated by it. I'll read you the poem first, and then I'll tell you a little bit more. So the poem is called Way of Peace, and it's the name, that's a translation of Wado Ryu, which is the name of the style of karate that pertained in the club. Way of Peace. And it's for someone called Eamon Keating, who's now deceased, and he was a much older man than me who joined this same club. And that's crucial. In Adidas runners and white karate suit with the simple crest, a dove around a fist, Wado Ryu, the way of peace. Down the Downs, that's a place in the town. Past the gatehouse gate, a chubby druid, a breathing oak, a shifting mountain, following patterns modelled on monkeys, eagles, and cranes, stray dogs and dragons. Birdman of Portlaoise, puff-jowled adder, dancing bear, a man in his 60s, somehow still sane enough to play. And me, 16, hidden among trees, glimpsing the way. So the Downs is and was a little forest park in the town of Portlaoise. It was kind of where the countryside, if you like, the slightly wilder countryside came up to stand face to face with the civilization of the town. And I was, as a kid, I used to go off for walks all the time on my own, also probably with a dog. I don't remember in this occasion. And on one particular day, I went walking down this lane through the woods, and I see this white movement. And it's this man who's also in the karate club with me, Eamon Keating. And he's quite a big man, like a dancing bear. He's, somewhat heavy and slow. And he's not like we're all 15 and 16 and we think we're Bruce Lee and we're jumping over cars and we're superheroes, basically. And he's down there just on his own. And he's doing his little bit of karate, very slow motion, like the way people practice Tai Chi. And it had such an effect on me because I saw him and he didn't see me. I instinctivly pulled back. Was I supposed to see him? And he was just doing his movements in the trees. And I wrote that. It was one of the first poems I ever wrote. And it was in my first book, but it was probably written 10 years before that book. And now I'm the age he was in that poem. So it has that poem, and he's long since dead. That poem has sustained me. Even when I'm writing it, I'm saying there's something, there's a lesson to be learned here. And now, 40 years later, 50 years later, 45 years, okay, years later, I'm still seeing in this poem that now I have to do what he did, because the next generation is going to see my movements and decide whether I was authentic or someone who was just a bullshitter looking for attention, like the worst of the poets, all the other poets except me.
Never. Wonderful. It also gives us the dimension of the subject, the lyric eye in the vast terrain of poetry. And
Yeah, and you see, you're there. I think that's the interesting thing. It's an interesting one to pick because the I is in it, but the I is in it as the first person singular I, but also as this I, as someone looking, someone describing. And to go back to your question, I think in a way this is what appeals to me. In a very simplified version, I am aware of this, but it's what appeals to me of at least part of the Japanese tradition, the haiku tradition, the tanka tradition, that it is very much the power of it for me is that it's an eye, it's an attention to external detail. It's an eye on nature. It's what's going on in the world, in the cycle of the seasons. And everything is descriptive, of course, of the observer, but the observer is very seldom mentioned. And I find that so, it's a psychic balance that I think in the West we need, and maybe in Irish poetry we need, where I is maybe a bit too powerful. But for instance, you think across the water, our nearest neighbour, you think of Wordsworth, and Wordsworth goes out in his famous poem and he sees the daffodils. There are daffodils now starting to appear here in Ireland at the moment. We're coming into the season. The bluebells are out at the moment. And he starts that poem by saying, I wandered lonely as a cloud. I. The very first word in the poem is me. I look at me. I'm going to now, come on, I'm going to show you. But if that poem were from the Japanese tradition, if you like, from the haiku tradition, there would be no first person singular. You would see a picture of the daffodil and maybe a suggestion of changing time, or the relationship of the one daffodil to the host of golden daffodils. That camera zoom in and out that haiku is so good at. But it's very unlikely that the poet would be in the poem. And the poet certainly wouldn't be the first presence in the poem. So there's a really interesting habit that in the West, we tend to not just present what we see, but we tend to defend it because we saw it, I was there, so I'm in the poem as well. Whereas, as I said, this is very simplistic reduction of something much more complex. But in the Japanese tradition, in the haiku tradition, we dispense with all that reportage. We just get the thing. And that's very interesting. So I think that's one of the reasons why, for me, there's always a mental dialogue with Japan. I'm 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 quite a long-winded person. When you start me talking, I have a lot to say, maybe
oh,
too
that's
much.
That's
Um,
wonderful. I thank you.
so it's a psychic balance. It helps me sometimes to reduce and to cut back and say, no, you don't need all that. In conversation, that's one thing, but in a poem, no. And again, as I said earlier, because many of my poems are autobiographical, there's a temptation to feast on the I, to be I, me, all the time. Um, so it's a caution, and it's an opportunity to see another way that poetry can work. That it's not all about that first person view, where the first person is also present at all times.
Lovely. I think you have just invited us all to look into your website, www.petborn.com, where we can find some of Pat Bourne's wonderful poems. And waveforms really caught my attention. I wish we had more time to continue this wonderful conversation. Listening to you has given us so much insight and understanding on writing, on the relation between East and West, and the words, and those who create, the poets and the writers in general. What I'll do to wrap up, I think just before wrapping up, I'd like to go back to just one final idea, which is the idea of your movement and your change along the years in your writing. And I think the haiku in waveforms it translates all this change that you have decided to, the new path you have decided to take by consolidating the image and the words and the sound and the music. So there's a mixture there, which is, for those who study poetry, is really amazing. So before we finish, I would just like to read the translation of the one you have just read, which was the Path to Peace.
That was Way of Peace, was it? Yeah.
Way of Peace. Caminho da Paz.
Okay.
Vestindo tênis Adidas e vestes brancas de karatê com brasão simples, uma pomba em volta do punho, o Abril, o caminho da paz. Pelos vales verdejantes, para além da entrada do portão da casa, um druida rechonchudo. Carvalho que respira, montanha que se movimenta, seguindo padrões inspirados em macacos, águias e garças, cães vadios e dragões, o homem-pássaro de Portles, uma víbora com papo inflado, um urso dançante, um homem na casa dos 60, de alguma forma ainda são o suficiente para brincar. E eu, aos 16 anos, escondido entre as árvores, vislumbrando o caminho. Obrigada. And I invite those who are watching us not only to visit Pat Bourne's website, but also to visit Cadernos de Literatura em Tradução for this month's issue, which brings José Huguenin's translation of some of Pat Bourne's poems with some brief introduction of his work as well. So once again, Pat, thank you very much for taking the time, for being with us, and I hope we are in touch and continue this talk in other ways. Thank you.
That's great. It's my pleasure. It's always interesting to talk to someone else and try to figure out what one is at. So I get something out of this as well, I have to say. So I appreciate the interest and wish you well, and I hope we'll carry on at some stage in the future.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.